Good afternoon, everybody. I am Andrew Capetta, the manager of collection and exhibition programs at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I'd like to welcome you to today's desktop dialogue. While other guests are joining us, use this time to familiarize yourself with the chat interface. To join the chat, just enter your name, or really any name that you prefer, and click to agree to the terms of service and privacy policy. You can use this chat to make comments during the program at any time. If you want to make comments now, feel free to let us know where you're coming from. And when you have a question, just pop it in the chat too. And we're going to turn to those questions towards the end of the program. Below the screen is a list of web resources that relate to this afternoon's program, so feel free to take a look at those now or later. They include links to the exhibitions as well as specific objects on our collection online. And lastly, this program is being recorded, so you can watch it later on the CMA website or on our YouTube channel. So if you need to duck out early, you want to watch it again, or if you want to share with a friend who you think would be interested, look on our website and our YouTube channel later today or tomorrow. So for today's program, Authenticating Antiquity, we're going to be diving into one of the many mini exhibitions that make up the recently opened Stories from Storage. This is sort of like a really kind of a large project in which the museum's 17 curators, as well as our director and our chief curator, tell stories about their respective collection areas and sort of areas of expertise, highlighting works that are seldom on view. And in his selection, Replication and Reinterpretation, Old and New, Seth Pevnick, who is the CMA's curator of Greek and Roman art, looks at the theme of replication, which we could define as copying, adapting, or emulating, specifically in ancient art. And in doing so, he explores some of the many ways ancient art historians and conservators analyze works of art, including at times judging whether they are authentic or not. So just to discuss this really interesting and knotty issue and that this exhibition brings up, we're really lucky to have Seth with us this afternoon. Welcome, Seth. And I think, Seth, you might be muted. And the conservator that researched and analyzed many of them in the exhibition, Colleen Snyder, who's the Associate Conservator of Objects at CMA. Colleen.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Great. Welcome both. So I want to start with you, Seth. If you could tell us more about how replication and reinterpretation, old and new, came to be, and give us, if you could give us a sense of what the visitors will see and experience when they come to CMA.
Sure. This is a topic I've been thinking about for a long time. Some of these are objects that I've been looking at for a couple of years since I arrived at the CMA in storage, and others I discovered along the way. The main idea is in the title, really, and that's what you mentioned, that in ancient art we see a lot of images that seem to repeat themselves over and over again. But I wanted people to look a little bit more closely to try to understand that sometimes things are not exactly what we might think they are, and that ancient Greece and Rome are cultures that lasted for many, many centuries. And so when we're talking about the art of the ancient Mediterranean world, it's not a single monolithic entity that we're looking at. In the gallery, you'll see about 40 different objects, and they range from little tiny things that you could hold in your hand to life-size sculptures like the ones that you see here. And this first image that we're looking at is what you'll see right when you walk into the gallery. And there's actually one object, which I think you and I discussed, Andrew, a few months ago when I was on this program, and that's the head of Vespasian, which was has been on view for many, many years in the Roman gallery. So that's sort of the one exception to the fact that everything else was drawn from storage. But the reason that that's in the show is because it actually had a story in storage. And the story is that it was connected to the statue that you see just behind it in the photograph, the body without a head. When they were acquired by the CMA in 1929, the head and the body were attached to one another, even though in all likelihood, that's not the way that they were originally intended to to be displayed when they were made in ancient Rome. If we move to the next photo, there we go, thank you. You can see a couple of vases. So these are about 500 or 600 years earlier than the sculptures that we just looked at, but again, have really interesting stories to tell about replication and reinterpretation. So the large vase that we see on the left might remind people of Corinthian pottery made in Corinth, Greece in the 6th century BC. That's often characterized by these friezes with animals sort of marching around the outside of a vessel. But in fact, this one was made in Etruria by an Etruscan potter who was perhaps emulating objects that had been imported. So a great example of the ways that ancient cultures borrowed from one another. And then on the right, a beautiful red figure kylix, a wine cup that has a really interesting history of restoration over the course of many, many centuries. And we're going to dive into that in more detail later. But let's look at the next image. Here are some great examples of mold-made objects. And of course, objects that are made in molds are by their very nature replicas of one another, right? Everything that you produce from a single mold will be just about identical to the other objects that are made from the same mold. And so these are examples in glass as well as terracotta. And then beyond that, if we look at the next photo, we see a number of coins, which again are by their nature replicas of one another. And I would just add that in antiquity, this was very, very important because unlike our money today, which is basically worth what we say it's worth, in antiquity, coins were worth their weight, right? So a silver drachma was not only the name for a coin, but also the name for a unit of weight that that particular coin held. And this was a great opportunity with this exhibition to bring out a number of ancient coins, which haven't been on view, but I think deserve a closer look. And then we have a couple more photos. This one is a really interesting case full of objects that occupy a sort of middle ground. Some of these are ancient with some modern interventions. A couple of them look ancient, but might turn out to be entirely modern, as we'll talk about later on. But a really interesting grouping of objects. And then beyond those in the background, you can see some very large scale marble sculptures, which are good illustrations of the way that much of Roman sculpture is influenced by Greek sculpture that was made centuries earlier. And then finally, the last photo, this is a really interesting grouping of objects. You can see two pairs of objects. That's because these are replicas that were made in the early 20th century, probably, of prehistoric objects that one can find now in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And with them is the sales catalog from which they were ordered by this museum. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on.
You know, like each case is like a little argument, right, or a way of approaching this question, which I think is really exciting. And Colleen, I'd like to bring you in the conversation. Is that, you know, conservation is of huge importance in making sure that all of these, you know, objects are you know, on view and are stable, right? But a lot of, you know, folks out there might not know how much work that, you know, you and your department does to prepare objects for an exhibition, right? Because so much is behind the scenes, so much is not in public view. Could you tell us a little bit about your day-to-day work and how you prepared some of the objects for replication and reinterpretation?
Yeah, I'd love to. You know, the amount of work that each object takes to get ready for an exhibition varies immensely according to its needs. And hopefully by the time you and our visitors see it in the gallery, it's already looking its best. So maybe it won't be immediately clear how much work it's taken to get it to that point. But I wanted to talk about one object in specific that we got ready for the exhibition, and that's this headless figure wearing a toga. And it's carved from a solid block of marble. And you can see here in the image of it before treatment, there's a lot of dark gray dirt and grime on the surface from years of touching and dust that's accumulated. And I knew immediately in looking at that it would be a really good candidate for something called laser cleaning. So laser technology has evolved into a really sophisticated way of cleaning art objects because it's capable of really fine adjustments. And just as a little interesting fact, we use the same type of laser that people use to get an old tattoo removed. So it's actually a really gentle way of cleaning objects. And the way it works is that the dirt on the surface of an object will absorb the energy and the pulses of light that this laser gun is emitting. And it's causing that dirt to be ejected from the surface. So you can see here in this video with a lot of skill and patience and several days of work. You can see my colleague and I taking turns working on this. We went through each fold of drapery and we were able to reveal that nice original marble color underneath all that dirt.
Sorry, I'm having a lot of technical issues, I think you can probably tell. But Colleen, I know that kind of conserving objects and restoring objects has really sort of changed a lot over time. And I know that, Seth, you mentioned earlier a Kylix that's in CMA's collection, right, which is on view in the exhibition, has been repaired, right, in really many different ways over its lifetime. So, Colleen, could you kind of share a little bit of that sort of like history of its sort of life as an object and how its different sort of states have reflected these sort of different sort of methods and approaches to restoration over time? I know that's one of the sort of topics, right, that Seth, the exhibition covers.
Yeah, absolutely. This object is really interesting because you know, there have been people doing what I do, which is to try to preserve important objects, important artworks for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this object that Seth pointed out earlier was originally formed by throwing it on a wheel as one main piece of clay, and then the handles were added separately, and it was fired. And it might not look like it from this image, but it actually now exists as 72 separate fragments because it was broken. And if you look on an image of the inside of the cup, I don't know if our viewers can see that right now, but on the inside of the cup, you'll see that when the most recent conservation effort took place, the conservator found about 20 small drill holes, and you can actually still see 2 of those drill holes. It's just to the left of the satyr's head on the left side of the cup. And those go straight through the ceramic. And that's an old traditional method of ceramic repair where they would drill those holes and then insert a metal staple into the object to hold those 2 pieces together. And I have a photo of another object, which actually still has those staples in place. You can see in the areas that are highlighted, there are actually these white-looking areas, and those are corroded lead. And those are still left there from ancient times, although with our object, those were removed before it came to us. So even though our modern conservation treatment on the Kylix used reversible and stable adhesives, those 2 holes were left open as kind of a little window into the past and, you know, what its life has been.
No, that's really really interesting to see those, you know, to see such like a sort of an old method. And I think we've been talking about this. One of the things I'm kind of always reminded of is how you know, you're kind of treating these objects almost like you know, bodies in some ways, because I'm thinking of these as sort of like stitches or sutures, which have changed over time, right? With new technologies, or you mentioned the sort of laser cleaning as something that is also used to sort of remove tattoos. So I keep thinking of these as like people or human beings or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, a lot of people would compare what we do to kind of like being art doctors. I mean, we do use a lot of the same equipment. We use scalpels. I would just say, I'm lucky because my patients don't move around on me.
That's good. That's good. And they won't, they can't complain afterwards, right?
Absolutely not.
Which is um, awesome. So I think for maybe we'll, Seth, if it makes sense, does it make sense for us to sort of jump to a sort of a particularly kind of, curious object, and that's our a very well-known object, this sort of wild boar vessel that's in the CMA's collection. And as you said earlier, Seth, your exhibition is about the sort of idea of replication, reinterpretation, or copying and adapting, and that's kind of like, as you, I think you argue and you mentioned in other conversations about the show and about ancient art, that's like a feature of ancient art, right? There are different cultures borrowing from each other in the Mediterranean world. But you also sort of reflect on this issue in the more contemporary ancient art market, in which there are deceitful replicas, or what we can call forgeries, right, that are sort of circulated and traded. And you question the authenticity of this really well-loved object, this sort of wild boar vessel. So could you tell us more about like what led you to investigate it, and what you found out, especially in working with Colleen?
Sure. So this wild boar vessel, as you mentioned, is a fairly well-known object. And actually, when I arrived at the CMA almost 2 years ago, this was one of the files that was on my desk waiting for me, with a note saying, we need to look into this, because I wasn't the first one to doubt this object. So other people had noticed that our boar vessel, which is the one that you see at the top left, I think, of your screen, is very unusual. And what's unusual about it is that it's a very realistic rendering of a boar. If you look at the way, in particular, the eyes and the snout and the tusks and the ears, that's all very naturalistic. And that's something that's characteristic of ancient art only beginning really in the 5th century BC. Whereas the surface decoration and the fabric of this vessel, this is a terracotta vessel, but the way that the surface has been highly burnished and fired in a reducing atmosphere that gives it this sort of mottled brownish color. And then you can also see the rouletted decoration, the incised decoration. All of that is characteristic of a much earlier time period. And so if we look at the slide that I think we saw earlier with the comparison images, the really shiny black boar vessel that you see at the bottom is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And this is a fairly common type, starting around the 4th century BC. Whereas the vessel that you see on the right, which has a fabric and a surface treatment very similar to our boar, is more characteristic of vessels created in the 8th or 7th centuries BC, maybe the 6th. But there's not really an overlap between naturalistic form and that surface treatment. And so that was hard for me to reconcile, and hard for other people to reconcile as well. And as I spoke with colleagues at other institutions, no one could find a great parallel for this. And that doesn't mean that it's fake, right? There are always unique objects out there. But it prompted me to go to Colleen and say, let's take a look at this more carefully. And I think we both agreed right away, once we had ruled out any close parallels in other collections, we both agreed that it was worth taking the next step of doing a thermoluminescence test. And I think Colleen can tell us more about how that works.
Yeah, what you describe that? What is that? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When Seth came to me with this object and these really interesting questions about what it was, and visual analysis didn't really give us any additional helpful clues about what was going on, we decided the next best step would be to test a small sample of the ceramic with something called thermoluminescence, or TL testing. And this is something that we turn to in conservation to date crystalline materials like ceramic, like this is, by measuring the amount of absorbed radiation since the object was last exposed to light or heat. So in this case, when it was last fired, when it was made.
Yeah, all the date from that, because yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So before I went the step of taking the sample, I wanted to know a little bit more about whether there might be repairs or other things going on beneath the surface that I couldn't see. So I took it for an X-ray. And we do have in-house facilities. We can do digital X-rays. And you see here, it's the same as when you go to a doctor to look at a broken bone. The areas that are whiter are more dense. And you can see some of the fractures in the body that have occurred over time. But you can also see that the interior is hollow and all the ceramic looks really consistent throughout. So with that in mind, I got set up for sampling. And I decided that the most stable and easily accessed areas would be to take samples from the feet. So you can see here, I'm borrowing another tool from the medical industry. I'm using a dental drill bit. And getting set up to remove what is a very small sample. So about the size that we take is what you see there on the right. We take really the minimum necessary. But when I actually take a TL sample, because you remember if it's exposed to light, that will reset the sample. I have to actually do this in the dark under a safe light. So it's a little extra added stress while taking the sample. But this is something that we're used to doing, and we were able to send the sample off to some scientists. And I was able to tell Seth that this dated to less than 100 years ago, which I think Seth confirmed some of your suspicions.
Yeah. So then what was the final verdict then, Seth? Like putting all this information together, like having kind of Colleen's analysis, your sort of art historical, archaeological investigations.
Yeah.
What's the
Well, it's sort of a bittersweet moment, right? Because the scientific results validated the doubts that I had, but it's also disappointing. This was an object, as we mentioned, that was beloved by a lot of visitors. I think if you still go online and Google CMA bore vessel, you'll see some of the memes that people created. But ultimately, with all of this evidence in hand, I decided that the most responsible thing we could do was to take it off view, because we don't typically display fakes or forgeries in our galleries. And if we go back to our collection online view, you can see it is still available for people to look at on our website. And I updated what we call the tombstone information, the basic information about the vessel. It had said that it was made in Italy 2,500 years ago or thereabouts. And it still says that that's a possibility, or a modern forgery, it says. And so I've put both of those options out there. That I should add, there are some very rare instances when an ancient object might give the results that we got in thermoluminescence testing, right? If it had somehow been exposed to a very high temperature 100 years ago, then that would upset the results. But the balance of the evidence suggests to me pretty overwhelmingly that this is almost certainly a forgery. And so for that reason, it's not on view normally in our permanent collection galleries, but I thought for this exhibition, it was a great opportunity to bring it back on view and to show it to people in a slightly different context. And I think in this context, it makes a lot of sense, and I hope people will be happy to see it again.
No, that's kind of great. And I think, as you said, it kind of teaches in some ways a different sort of lesson in some ways, or tells a different story now, which is kind of really exciting, right? And in line with the sort of with stories from storage,
right?
And that idea of using it to tell stories that we don't tell in our galleries. I kind of wanted to maybe move on to sort of one last sort of kind of theme, right? And actually, like Seth, the kind of case of the wild boar, maybe I'll call it that, makes me think of like the expectation, right, that museums should be authorities of authenticity, right? Like you're only going to put something on view if it is authentically from that particular time and place, which explains why you made the decision that you do. But that brings me to this larger question. is, can a replica, right, maybe not something that is a deceitful forgery, right, but can a replica still have an educational value? Can it still have aesthetic value? Can it still have historic value in your mind?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And of course, I'm biased. I'm very interested in not only ancient history, but also the more modern history of studying the ancient past. And so for me, objects like the ones that we're looking at here are really, really interesting. And they speak not only to what the ancient world was like, but also what Cleveland and the Cleveland Museum of Art was like 100 years ago. So as I mentioned earlier, these two pairs of objects are replicas of objects that are now in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The originals are prehistoric, made in the Bronze Age, and were discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in Mycenae, in the prehistoric citadel of Mycenae, Greece, in 1876. And these are not meant to fool anybody. If you've taken a course on ancient Greek art and archaeology, you might even recognize, especially the objects on the left. I think we have a view of the original object in Athens. This is the so-called Mask of Agamemnon. We're looking now at our replica, and it's easy to tell that ours is a replica. There's the original. The original is made from almost paper-thin gold, which is hammered into shape. Whereas ours is an electrotype. It's made from a totally different process, but it's made from a mold of the original. And so it's just about the same size and the same shape and the same form. But if you were to hold it in your hands, it would feel very, very different. And if you are to look at it carefully and closely, you would know that it's different. Not to mention the fact that the original is unique, and we have two of the replicas in our case downstairs. But we also have the book, the sales catalog from which they were purchased. And I think that's a great historical document, because if you think about the way that museums worked 100 years ago and the way that the world worked, right? If I want to see the Mask of Agamemnon, I go on my computer or even on my phone and I type in Mask of Agamemnon, and instantly I can see it, right? But 100 years ago, that was not possible. You might be able to get a black and white image like this, or if you were lucky, the local museum might have an electrotype replica, which is the same size and shape and gold plated. So it even looks in its surface a lot like the original. And so this was a different way of teaching people about the ancient world. And not only the ancient world, right? There were replicas of all sorts of famous art objects in museums, not only in Cleveland, but all over the US and Canada and many, many cities in Europe as well. So it's, as I say, a sort of historical document that can tell us more about the way that people learned about the ancient world 100 years ago.
Yeah, it makes me think of, right, as you're pointing out, this sort of the idea of museums like of over a century ago, at least in their founding in this country, but also in Europe earlier, right? As these places of study, and casts were part of that, because as you said, right, there's a unique object, but we want to know about it. So then museums would collect, right, plaster casts, and that's what filled many institutions. So that's a really, I think, great way of sort of thinking about the history, right, and how our understandings of what we expect in this space have maybe changed, right, over time, which is an important thing to recognize, right? And Colleen, I wanted to sort of end with some about how conservation has used sort of replication processes, more contemporary ones, to better understand objects, right, in the museum collection. I think there's an example of a sort of a mold from ancient Rome, if I'm correct, of a person's head. And could you explain like what sort of replication process you went through, and why it was important for you to sort of uh, go through that process with this particular mold?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see in the lower right side of this case, there is a terracotta mold from ancient times that, when clay was pressed into it, would produce an object that looked like a small man's head. And traditionally, we would want to kind of create our own molded object so the visitor can better understand what object would have been produced from that mold. And that involves, applying some kind of release agent like talc to this ancient object, impressing some clay in there, all things that are potentially harmful to the object. This one actually has a crack right through the center, a very old repair. So instead of doing that, we actually turned to our museum photographer, and he used something called photogrammetry, where he was able to take a series of photographs of this ancient mold and compile them on the computer into a three-dimensional image. And we worked with ThinkBox, which is a makerspace at Case Western Reserve University, and they helped us refine that 3D image on the computer, and we were able to actually have it printed at their facility in this orange color, which is the best approximation of terracotta that their machine was capable of. And you can see that here. So without actually really handling the object at all, without pressing anything into it, we were able to use all the best of modern technology to produce the replica of what they would have seen in ancient times when they pushed clay into that mold.
And it makes me again think, of course, of like a medical because I'm thinking of like technologies in surgery, right? How to be the least invasive, right? And that's kind of the goal, right?
Absolutely, that's always our goal. Yeah.
And you're able to practice that here, which is really amazing. So thank you so much, Seth and Colleen. I'm going to thank you again, but we have some great questions already. I'm going to ask the audience to keep them coming, but there's one sort of comment from Stephanie, and then I'll go to some of the questions, that says the global meme community who is going to be really interested in this update about the wild boar. I agree. So maybe there'll be some new memes about it. So that's exciting. We have a question from Joanne Havala. Maybe Seth, you would know, or at least where we can find this information about the provenance of the boar, because I know that's something you did kind of look into a little bit as well, if I'm correct. But yeah, could you share what you might know?
Sure. So that's one of the complicating factors, right? If we could trace its modern history to a proper archaeological excavation where it came out of the ground, we probably wouldn't doubt it so much. This came, like many objects in our museum and in many other museums, from the art market. And it was purchased by the museum from a dealer in 1977. And in the course of my research, I actually did go through the archives of this particular dealer. They're available at another research institution. And unfortunately, I didn't find anything in those archives that would validate the authenticity of the boar. And so I wish that we had more information. I have sort of a dream that maybe one day we'll be able to trace it back. If it actually is a forgery, maybe we can actually find the person who created it. And that may sound outlandish, but there is precedence for that, for other fakes that have been on display in other museums, and sort of a smoking gun was found and people were able to trace it back to a particular workshop where it may have been made. So I won't say hold your breath, but stay tuned, and maybe eventually we'll be able to give a little bit more information.
Yeah, no, that does make a lot of sense though, in terms of like because then all of a sudden, right, then we then know more about that whole network of objects, right? By making those connections. So it makes a lot of sense, right? We have a question from Carl Walsh, who says, I work with the Egyptian objects in the Barnes Foundation, looking at authenticity. And so I am interested if you also deal with Egyptian forgeries, modern production replicas in your collection. So maybe it might be a question for Seth, but also Colleen, if you've also worked on anything too.
We're actually part of a study out of the Getty right now to look at the Egyptian panel portraits in our collection. So, we've been looking closely at our Fayum portraits, and lots of institutions have been compiling data on that. So we're still in the process of gathering information, running some tests, and compiling all that. But I think the value in a bunch of institutions like that working together and comparing data with any artworks is that when you have a whole series of things being compared in the same way at the same time, you can really learn a lot about the objects, the time period, the people who made it.
Right. I would add, I don't think anyone is doubting the authenticity of our Fayum portraits, but this project that Colleen mentions will tell us a lot more about the production techniques that were used. In terms of fakes and forgeries in our Egyptian collection, I believe there are a couple, but I must admit I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm not as familiar with that collection, and I don't know about any replicas. These electrotypes that we're showing of the Mycenaean objects are actually part of an education art collection, which is a separate collection from what's normally on view in our galleries. And the education art collection includes quite a lot of replica objects, not only Greek, but all different kinds. So in my exhibition, we have some replica Roman oil lamps, but it runs the gamut in terms of cultures and chronology. So that's something we'd have to look into.
Thank you. Thanks. Peter has a great sort of, I think, question about maybe repair, about methods of repair. He says in Cincinnati they have Islamic ceramics where missing pieces are just plain background, and I've seen that as well, right? So with the Kylix on display, the satyr's face seems to be a filler with some basic outlines. I don't know, Jeff, if we could go to the Kylix at all. Why not just make a plain background so only the authentic pieces are shown? I don't know, maybe Colleen, do you want to start? And
Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, in conservation, we're always really careful when we do fills of missing pieces to not just kind of invent information if we don't have enough clues on the surrounding pieces to tell us what exactly that would have looked like. I know that the conservators that worked on this object, they did try various ways. They did try kind of a blank piece, but it was too kind of disturbing when viewed, I think, to get the full picture of what that character was. So they were able to look at a lot of very close other examples, and they decided to just do the outline of the face to kind of show what it would have been, but they didn't make up details like, you know, how the eyes looked or anything else. So it's kind of a little bit of an in-between method of compensation.
Yes,
I would add also, with this cup, I mentioned, and Colleen mentioned, this long history of restoration. And when this cup was acquired in 1915, it apparently had been so heavily overpainted. They filled in the satyr's face, but I think they also covered up some aspects of the satyr that are satyr-like, but maybe not the kinds of things people wanted to see in 1915. It was so overpainted with modern fill that it wasn't appreciated for what it was. And it was only in the 1950s when it was taken to pieces and reassembled that scholars were able to understand that this is actually probably by the vase painter Duris, who's one of the more important vase painters of the early 5th century BC in Athens. And so there are sort of these trends, right, that in the 19th century and early 20th century, people didn't want things to be incomplete. Then there was a trend for a while where they wanted only to see what was authentic. And now we're sort of in this middle ground, as Colleen said, where at first glance, you'll look at the cup and you won't see that anything is missing. But then if you go to look carefully, you'll see, oh, we don't actually have the satyr's face. So it's, I think, a nice balance. It's not distracting, but it's also being truthful.
Yeah, I was going to say about this sort of, I guess, maybe that I'd say like the ethics of it, you know, in a way that it sort of is not maybe overtly disruptive to the experience, understanding the whole picture, but then you sort of can see what, what is sort of authentic and what is a repair. And that's a
Yeah.
really interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Colleen, please.
I was just going to say that's absolutely part of a conservator's ethics is that, if, like Seth said, if you're within a few inches of the object, somebody would be able to distinguish maybe where a fill is. But if you're a couple feet away, it shouldn't be so distracting that you can't appreciate the whole of the object. And something else to mention as we're zoomed in real up close is that also as conservators, we're very, very careful to never overpaint onto the original material. So Seth was saying before, they covered over original material. But now, we're working under the microscope with extremely fine tools to make sure that we have every bit of that original material showing and only fill in between.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm really glad we were able to kind of zoom in even further. This is great. We have maybe time for one more question from Natalie A. Though if people still have more, it's just always good to see, your questions. Natalie asks, do you ever get or accept commissions or questions from the public about, to find the authenticity of an object? Like I'm assuming, Natalie, you mean something that might be in their possession. I know that's something that is sort of a very common question that museums face. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Colleen, if you have a thought, and then feel free if you can. If you don't have to, Seth, pipe in, but if you want to, you can.
Yeah, we don't take privately owned artworks and do the testing on them within the museum. We're really focused on the collection that we have here and caring for and investigating it. But certainly, the American Institute for Conservation is the organization that I belong to, and they do have a tool on there called Find a Conservator, where you can put in where you live, and you might be able to find somebody nearby who can help guide you and find a way for you to look at and test your object. So certainly, we always work really hard to help people find the right person to get that information.
That's great. That's a great resource. Thank you. Thank you, Colleen. Seth, is there anything you'd like to add to that, or?
I would say, in addition to conservators, you might want to check with an appraiser or an art dealer, an auction house. Any of those might be able to help you with questions about authenticity.
Yeah. No, this is it's always helpful. In the last museum I worked, there was always that question as well, that arose, and had the same, I think, policy, which makes a lot of sense. So, well, I really want to thank both of you for your time this afternoon. Thank you so much, Seth, and so much, Colleen.
It was a pleasure.
Sure. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and I can't wait to see this exhibition in person. I'm going to have to snatch up a ticket real soon. I want to thank all of you out there for coming and let you know that Desktop Dialogues has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Endeavor. And I also wanted to alert you to a couple of upcoming programs that we're having. Next Wednesday, February 24th at 6 p.m., we're going to have a program titled Changing the Stories Museums Tell, which is going to be a conversation between Lynn Harrison, who's the director and CEO of the New York Museum of Art, Rahima Barber, who's the chief curator of the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts, and CMA's own Kijo Lee. They're going to discuss the ways that they, as museum leaders and professionals, have really transformed sort of conventional museum narratives and practices in their different ways, in their different areas, to introduce historical incidents, artists, subjects, and ideas that are often left out of the story in order to build a different and more inclusive future for museums. So we're really excited about this conversation. It's a much, kind of a needed one. If you'd like to attend, just reserve your tickets at cma.org. And I also wanted to point out that our next Desktop Dialogue is in 2 weeks from today, on March 3rd at noon, and it's titled Storytelling in Japanese Art. And I'm going to be joined by Sinead Vilbar and CMA intern Gina Lopez. And we're going to closely examine and read an illustrated hand scroll of the family drama The Saltmaker Story, which is in our Japanese collection. So to find out more about these and other programs, just visit cma.org. If you'd like to explore more of the works in our collection, just visit CMA's collection online. And if we didn't get to your question during the program, or if you have any others that come up, you can always go to ArtLens Ask on the CMA website. And there are links to all of these things below to ArtLens Ask and also our collection online. So I want to thank all of you for coming and have a pleasant afternoon.